Anyway, yeah. So I'm against proof texting. Everyone does it. The Roman Catholic Protestant polemics just constantly proof text from both sides. You'll get these books of citations of the fathers on Peter, where anytime they talk about Peter in a positive light, it's these, all these quotes are just kind of thrown in there and smushed together. And wow, it looks like a great testimony of the papacy. But it's because you've just taken a bunch of out of context quotes where people say things about Peter that are positive in his role as the chief apostle. Like, he is the leader of the apostles in the New Testament. I don't know that there is much of a dispute about that in terms of his taking that leadership role. I mean, that's why he is the one who receives the keys first. He's the one who speaks up. He's the spokesperson of the apostles. We do see a bit of seemingly a kind of a transfer of that leadership role to Paul later, at least to some degree. But there's no questioning that. And that stuff is cited by the fathers. So you find the same thing with some Protestant polemics dealing with the question of justification, is that, and I was mentioned the same book, but Thomas Oden's Justification Reader, because I just think it's a great example of it, where any quote that has justification and faith together is cited there as proof of sola fide in the Church Fathers. And that's just not a good way to interact with the text, because a lot of those fathers in context say something very different. And I mean, the fact is, Scripture just has those words together. So just because someone cites, Romans 3:28 doesn't mean that they understand it in the Protestant context. So I just don't find it to be a fair reading of the fathers. You find this as well with, there was I don't know where this originally came from, but there's somewhere online and it came from a book originally. There's a collection of quotes from the fathers proving the 5 points of Calvinism. And people share this all the time. Like, I've seen so many times. I think I actually went through this on one of my really early podcasts, and you'd have to, I don't know where, so you may have to go through the archives if you want to find it, but where there are citations from all the fathers on every point of Calvinism, and it proves that the fathers were 5-point Calvinists. And, I've gone through and looked up every single quote from these fathers, and it is such an abuse of the actual texts when you go look at it in context. The thing is, as Christians, we tend to read the fathers in a way that we would never read the Scripture. And if someone read Scripture in the way that we use the fathers in polemics, we would rightly, Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise, rebuke them for it and say, that is so out of context. That's the way a cult uses Scripture. But we do the same thing when it comes to the fathers, and somehow think that method of doing things is okay in that context. So we've got to be honest with the text. We've got to be nuanced. And I think the situation is just complicated. And we also have to be pretty okay with the complexity. And I think from any perspective, whether it's Orthodox or Roman Catholic or Protestant, we all want to have a very simplified, we read the fathers, they all believe what we believe. And it's just a complicated historical situation. The church was created in a certain context, historically and ideologically. That means that there are going to be ideological problems that creep into the church, but it also means that they're going to be asking different questions than we are. And as the ideology of the world changes, so will the questions the church asks, and that will necessarily result in a development of the way we speak about certain things and asking different questions. And we can't just go back to a pure era of the church and find something, that we find perfect. And I think this is a tendency that people generally have, is to idolize one particular era of church history and say, this is the golden age. We want to go back to that. I mean, you find this this is not just in theology. This is just in general. I mean, even, and this is not to get political, because I'm not political on this at all, but, even the popularity of the slogan, "Make America Great Again," not to make any comments about the American political mess. But that the idea behind that is there was an era that was good, and we need to go back to that. And this is a tendency that humans always have. This is why we like nostalgia so much. Because we look back to our childhoods and we think of it as this pristine era when things were so much better. They weren't. I mean, the world's always a mess. We were younger and probably were naive, and so we tend to kind of have these, rose-tinted glasses when we look at the past. So you find this with all sorts of traditions, is when they look back at one era and say, well, that was the perfect, pure era. You find this with Anglo-Catholicism, tends to do this with the medieval period. A lot of traditionalist Catholics do this with the Thomistic period. A lot of, Reformation, heirs of the Reformation go back to the Reformation period. My tendency to probably go back to the 17th century, because even though the world was kind of a mess politically, in terms of the 30 Years' War and all this stuff, I think probably was the best theological era that we had. And I generally think it was pretty good in a lot of ways, but it has its own issues as well. I think a lot of Reformed people do this with the Puritans, or and we tend to all do this in one way or another. So it's the temptation to do that with the fathers. To some degree, I think even with movements like classical education, we can do that. And I'm a huge proponent of classical education, by the way, huge fan. But I think that we can, unfortunately, retreat back to, we need to just recapture the past, which is not really healthy. We need to build on the past and recognize our present context as well. Which is why I am a proponent of classical education, but I also love modern art, which a lot of classicists tend to hate. So I don't know. I'm a weird person in that way. But my goal was always to kind of grab onto what was best in the past, but also recognizing present situation and recognizing development and the difference in questions, and not just repristinating. I don't think just repristinating is the best thing to do. Okay.